The garage door was wide open, and right then I knew something was wrong. My late husband's car was gone. 2 decades of his hard work had vanished overnight. My son had sold it to fund a trip to Paris with his wife. But a phone call the next morning changed everything. The man on the line said he had Harold's car. He said there was something my husband wanted me to know, something he had hidden before he passed away. I'm so glad you're here. If you're watching this video, hit that like button, subscribe to Stories of Mom Donna, and tell me where in the world you're listening from. My name is Elaine, and this is how my late husband saved my life and taught my son and his wife a lesson they'll never forget. Before we continue, please leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and subscribe to the Never Too Old channel, where we celebrate the idea that the best chapters of life can start at any age. Now, back to the story. The garage door was open. That's what caught my eye first as I stood in the kitchen, my coffee growing cold in my hands. I stared through the window above the sink. The door was rolled up, and the space inside was dark, even though daylight streamed in. Harold never left it open. In 43 years of marriage, not once had he left that door open overnight. But Harold was gone. 8 months now. I set down my cup, walked to the back door, opened it, and let the spring air hit my face, unusually warm for April. It was exactly the kind of morning Harold would have spent outside already, bent over that car with a rag in hand. I crossed the yard. The grass badly needed mowing. I kept meaning to call someone about that. The concrete felt cold under my slippers. The dark oil stain in the center of the garage floor was so familiar. 20 years of parking the same car in the same spot had left its mark. But now, the space was empty. Just empty. I stood there, staring at nothing. The workbench along the back wall was just as Harold had left it. His tools still hung neatly on the pegboard, each outlined in black marker, so he'd know where it belonged. His red toolbox sat closed on the bench, and his work journal lay open beside it, the pages filled with his neat, careful handwriting. The car was gone. My chest tightened. I gripped the doorframe and took deep, steady breaths in through my nose, out through my mouth. After 43 years as a nurse, I still used the same techniques I'd taught my ICU patients. Breathe, think, act. But my thoughts couldn't move past the emptiness. I walked to the workbench and picked up the journal. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before Harold died. His handwriting was tense at first, then looser than usual. Almost done, 20 years on this beauty. Can't wait to teach Elaine to drive her properly. Our retirement road trip starts next summer. I closed the journal and set it back exactly where it had been. The garage still smelled like him: motor oil, old leather, and that citrusy orange hand soap he always used. I could almost see him there, hear his music playing on that old radio. Classic rock. He'd sing along when he thought I wasn't listening. A car engine rumbled outside on Oakwood Drive. I turned and saw Scott's black BMW pulling into the driveway. Not bought leased, as he'd proudly mentioned at Christmas. Like that should have impressed me. My son stepped out from the driver's side, 38 years old, still unable to meet my eyes when he knew he'd done something wrong. Even from across the yard, I could tell by the way his shoulders slumped, the way he shoved his hands into his pockets. The passenger door opened, and Lydia got out. She was flawless, as always, sleek dark hair, designer sunglasses, clothes that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. She stood beside the car, staring at me in the garage. Even behind those glasses, I could feel her gaze. Scott walked toward me, stopping at the edge of the driveway. "Mom," I waited. "I need to talk to you about something." "Where's the car, Scott?" His jaw tightened. "That's what I need to talk about. Where is it?" "I sold it." The words hit me, but they didn't register right away, like he'd spoken another language, and my mind needed time to catch up. "You what?" "I sold it. Yesterday." He glanced at the empty garage, then at the ground. "I needed the money. Lydia's been planning this Paris trip for months. It's important for her business connections." I couldn't let her down. The tightness in my chest spread. My hands trembled, so I crossed my arms. "That was your father's car. It was just sitting there." His tone turned defensive, sharper. "Dad's gone, Mom. You don't even drive it." "It was his." "Was." Past tense. Scott finally looked at me, his eyes rimmed red, exhaustion written all over him. "I got a good price for it, too. $15,000. That's fair for a car that old." $15,000. For the car Harold spent every weekend perfecting. The car he restored bolt by bolt for 20 years. The car he swore would always stay in the family. I wanted to scream, to grab my son and shake him until he understood the weight of what he'd done. But 43 years in the ICU had taught me to keep my voice steady even when everything inside me was breaking. When did you take it? Yesterday afternoon. You were at the store. He still had his old house key, the one from before he moved out, before he met her. I never asked for it back. And Harold always left the garage unlocked, said he liked being able to get in there quick if inspiration hit. You should have asked me. Would you have said yes? No, I wouldn't have. That's when Lydia appeared, gliding up the driveway like she owned the place, the yard, the house, the whole neighborhood. She stood next to Scott, resting her perfectly manicured hand on his arm, crimson nails gleaming. Elaine, we're not discussing this. It's done. The car is sold. We leave for Paris tomorrow. I looked at her, really looked. 2 years of marriage to my son, and I still didn't know who she truly was. I didn't know where she'd grown up, what her parents did, or anything real about her life before Scott. She smiled often, but it never touched her eyes. This is between me and my son. I'm his wife. What's between you and him is between all of us. Her tone was calm, pleasant, condescending, as if she were explaining something obvious to a child. Scott needed that money. The car wasn't being used. Selling it made sense. It was his father's. His father is dead. She said it flatly, like it was just a fact on a page. And Scott's trying to build a life. We both are. Surely you understand that. I couldn't trust myself to speak. I just looked at Scott. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Lydia's hand stayed on his arm, possessive. We'll send you pictures from Paris, she said with a polished smile. You'd love it there. The architecture, the museums. Very romantic. The cruelty in her tone was so casual, it almost sounded innocent, but I knew better. Scott shifted uneasily. We should go. Still need to pack. Yes, Lydia murmured, tugging lightly on his arm. We have an early flight. They walked back to the BMW. Scott looked back once, just once, seeing me standing there in Harold's garage, arms crossed, slippers on. Then he got in the car. Lydia rolled down her window. Take care of yourself, Elaine. We'll see you when we get back. The BMW backed out and disappeared down Oakwood Drive. I watched until it turned the corner, leaving me alone. I walked back into the garage and stood over the dark oil stain where the car used to sit. The silence felt heavier now, emptier. Morning sunlight streamed through the open door, illuminating the dust swirling in the air. I picked up Harold's journal again, opened to his last entry, and read his words about teaching me to drive, about the retirement road trip we'd planned, about 20 years of work finally complete. His coffee mug was still on the shelf, stained from years of use, the handle worn smooth. I'd washed it after he died, but could never bring myself to put it away. Everything was still here, except the car, his tools, his workbench, his old radio, the scent of him in every corner, and the empty space where the Shelby should have been. I closed the journal and held it to my chest. The sunlight felt warmer now. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked and a lawnmower started up. Normal sounds on a normal morning, 8 months of widowhood, and I thought I'd run out of tears. But standing in that garage, holding Harold's journal, staring at the space our son had left behind, I felt them coming again. I locked the garage door, turned off the light, and walked back to the house, the journal still in my hands, the empty spot where the Shelby should have been felt like an open wound. The phone rang at 7 that morning, but I'd already been awake since 4. I was sitting at the kitchen table with Harold's journal open in front of me, staring at the same page over and over, the one where he'd written about replacing the carburetor. His handwriting was so neat, his notes so precise. The phone kept ringing. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Hello? Mrs. Bennett? A man's voice, rough and tired, like he'd been crying. This is Tom Graves from Graves Classic Auto. I have your husband's car. I sat up straight. What? The Shelby. Your son brought it in on Wednesday. I need you to come to the dealership, please. As soon as you can. There's something Harold wanted you to know. My mind spun, trying to piece the words together. I don't understand. Harold was my friend. A good man. His voice cracked. I was at his funeral. I should have spoken to you then, but I couldn't. I'm sorry. Please, Mrs. Bennett, can you come? I remembered him then, a man standing quietly in the back at the funeral home, gray hair, dark suit. He'd left before I could speak to anyone. Where are you? He gave me the address, an industrial area on the east side of town. I scribbled it down on the back of an envelope. I'll be there in 30 minutes. I changed into jeans and a sweater, grabbed my keys and drove across town, gripping the steering wheel tight. Morning traffic was light. I passed the hospital where I'd worked for 40 years, its parking lot already packed. The industrial area was all concrete buildings and metal siding. I found Graves' Classic Auto at the end of a long street. The place was neat and modern, rows of vintage cars lined up behind a chain-link fence, all shining in the early sunlight. A man stood outside the front entrance, gray-haired, maybe 65, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt. He looked like he'd been waiting for me. I parked, got out, and he came toward me. His eyes were red. Mrs. Bennett, thank you for coming. You're Tom? Yes. He held out his hand. I shook it. His grip was firm but trembling. I'm Tom Graves. Your husband saved my life 25 years ago. I waited. He looked down, took a breath. I needed a business loan, wanted to start this shop. No bank would touch me, bad credit, no collateral, just a dream and more guts than sense. He looked up. Harold co-signed for me, put his own credit and savings on the line for a stranger. I paid him back every penny, but the debt went deeper than money. He never told me. He wouldn't have. That's who Harold was. Tom's eyes watered. This dealership exists because of him. I've built a good life, all because your husband believed in me when no one else did. When your son brought that Shelby on Wednesday, I recognized it immediately. His voice roughened. Harold used to talk about that car every time we ran into each other. Car shows, auctions. He'd show me photos, tell me how the restoration was coming along. He was so proud of it. Scott said he sold it. He did. To me. Tom looked sick. Your son didn't realize what he was selling. I asked if he knew its value. He said $15,000 sounded fair. My stomach turned. What's it really worth? Tom met my eyes. Around $180,000. It's a documented 1,967 Shelby GT 500. Only 2,048 ever made. Harold restored it to museum quality. The number didn't register. 180,000? Yes, ma'am. And Scott sold it for 15? Yes. I sat down on the curb. Just sat there. Tom joined me. We stayed silent for a moment. Finally, he said, I bought it from him. Gave him the 15 because he seemed desperate. Said something about a Paris trip with his wife. But Mrs. Bennett, that car was never meant to be mine. Then why are you telling me this? Because Harold made me promise. Promise what? 2 years ago, Tom stood and offered me his hand. Come inside. There's something you need to see. He led me through the building and into the garage, a huge, spotless space with white floors and bright lights overhead. 3 cars sat in a neat row under their covers. Tom stopped at the last one and pulled the cover away. The Shelby gleamed beneath it, the deep burgundy paint flawless, the chrome shining like glass. I walked closer, slowly, and placed my hand on the hood. The metal felt cool and smooth beneath my palm. I could feel Harold in every detail of it. I opened the driver's door and slid into the leather seat. It smelled like home, like the garage where he'd spent so many weekends. The steering wheel was worn where his hands had gripped it. Tom leaned against the doorframe. 2 years ago, Harold asked me to help him install something, a hidden compartment. I looked up at him. Why? He said if anything ever happened to him, I was to make sure you found it. He made me swear. Tom nodded toward the dashboard. Behind the radio, I never looked inside. He told me it was for you, and only you. My heart pounded. Tom showed me how to release the panel, pressing one side, pulling another. The radio face came loose, revealing a small, dark space behind it. Tom stepped back, then quietly walked out, leaving me alone. I reached in and felt paper. I pulled out a thick manila folder. Underneath it was a sealed envelope with my name written in Harold's handwriting. At the bottom of the compartment sat a small wooden box with a key inside. I opened the envelope first. Harold's handwriting filled the page. But I needed to protect you from this until I had proof. I've been investigating Lydia for 18 months. She's not who she says she is. Her real name is Lydia Cortland. She's done this before, twice that I've confirmed. In this folder is everything I've found: photos, documents, contact information for her past victims. Their stories are the same. She targets men with aging parents and family assets. She's going to target our house, Elaine. That's her pattern. She'll convince Scott that you're declining, that you need care, that the house should be sold. Then she'll disappear with the money. I confronted her once, carefully, to see her reaction. She's very good at what she does. Scott doesn't see it. He won't believe me without hard evidence, and I don't have it yet. The key in this box is for our safe deposit box at First National, Box 447. Inside are stock certificates I bought in 1994 as a favor to a patient. Check the current value. You're financially secure. Tom knows to contact you if anything happens to this car. He's a good man. Trust him. Protect yourself. Protect our son. He's a victim in this too. I love you. I'm still protecting you. Harold. I read it twice, my hands trembling. Harold knew. He'd known about Lydia. He'd spent 18 months investigating her and died before he could finish. I opened the manila folder. Inside were photographs. Lydia at a wedding with another man, older, gray-haired. Another photo, another wedding, a different man. Copies of marriage certificates. Lydia Cortland married Stanley Wright, Phoenix, Arizona, June 2019. Lydia Cortland married George Murphy, Tampa, Florida, March 2021. Newspaper clippings followed. Local man reports elderly mother's life savings stolen by daughter-in-law. Another read, family business sold amid suspected fraud. There were pages of Harold's notes, observations about Lydia's behavior, questions she'd asked about our house, my health, our finances, all dated and timed. At the back, phone numbers and contact details for Stanley Wright in Phoenix and George Murphy in Tampa. Harold's final line at the bottom read, "Need more concrete proof before telling Scott. He won't believe me without it. She's too skilled. If you're reading this and I'm gone, please finish what I started. Protect our son." I closed the folder and pressed it to my chest. 8 months thinking I knew everything about our life. 8 months missing him, grieving him, while he'd been carrying this secret alone. The tears came hard this time, shaking me to the core. I sat in Harold's car, clutching his file, and cried for everything he'd tried to do. After a few minutes, Tom came back, standing quietly in the doorway. He didn't speak, just waited. I wiped my face, got out of the car, and met his eyes. He was still protecting me, even after he died. Tom nodded. That's who Harold was. I need to call these men, Stanley and George. I need to know what happened to them. You can use my office, he said softly. Take all the time you need. I looked at the Shelby, the car Harold spent 20 years bringing back to life. At the hidden compartment Harold had built with Tom. At the investigation he'd left behind for me to finish. She's not getting away with this. No, Tom said quietly. She's not. Stanley Wright picked up on the third ring. His voice sounded weary, like he'd been waiting for this call for years. I sat in Tom's office with the door closed, the phone on speaker so he could hear. My hands trembled as I dialed. Hello? Mr. Wright? My name is Elaine Bennett. I'm calling because my son is married to a woman named Lydia Cortland. There was a long silence on the other end, followed by a deep sigh. I wondered when this call would come. I gripped the edge of Tom's desk. Can you tell me what happened? Stanley, 58, spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, like he'd rehearsed this for a moment like this. He met Lydia in the spring of 2019 at a community center where his mother volunteered. Lydia was helping organize events. She was warm, charming, attentive. She started talking to him, seemed genuinely interested. His wife had died 3 years earlier, and he'd been lonely. They began dating. She was kind, patient, made him feel seen again. They married 6 months later. His mother had doubts, said something about Lydia didn't feel right. Stanley brushed it off, thinking she was being overprotective. After the wedding, Lydia started planting little comments. Your mom seems slower lately. Did you notice she forgot my name yesterday? Is that normal? I'm worried about her driving. What if something happens? Soon Stanley started seeing things differently. Ordinary aging began to look like decline. Lydia would leave articles about dementia on the kitchen table, stories about elderly falls and safety concerns. Over time, she built a case that his mother wasn't safe living alone. Then she found a memory care facility, the best in the state, she'd said. She deserves the best. $20,000 a month. The only way to afford it was to sell his mother's home. Stanley convinced her it was for her own good and sold the house she'd lived in for 42 years for $280,000. The money went into a joint account with Lydia. His mother moved into the facility a few months after the wedding. 2 weeks later, Lydia vanished, emptied the account, every cent, no forwarding address, no working number. Stanley tried to find her, filed police reports, but the money had been in both their names, so it was technically legal. His mother passed away 6 months later. His voice broke. She kept asking when she could go home. I told her soon, but there was no home left, and no money to get her one. I closed my eyes. I'm sorry. Mom was fine, Mrs. Bennet. A little forgetful, sure, but fine. She didn't need that place. She needed her home. He paused. Whatever Lydia's saying about you, don't believe her. Keep records of everything. She'll start small little comments about you forgetting things or being tired, and then she'll push harder. Thank you for telling me. Stop her, Stanley said. Please, don't let her destroy another family. I ended the call and stared at the phone. Tom brought me a glass of water. I took a sip, steadied myself, and dialed the second number. George Murphy picked up right away. George Murphy. I introduced myself, same words as before. He sighed. Lydia Cortland. Yeah, I've been waiting for this. George was 61. His story was different, but the pattern was the same. He met Lydia at his father's funeral in early 2021. She was there supporting a friend, found him afterward, offered condolences, said she knew grief, said she'd lost someone too. They talked for hours. She helped him through the worst of it. They started dating a month later. His friends warned it was too soon, but he didn't care. Lydia made the pain easier to carry. They married 8 months later. His father had owned a small auto repair shop for 40 years. George inherited it but couldn't bring himself to run it too many memories. Lydia suggested selling. It's too much pressure. Sell it. We'll use the money to travel, to heal, start over. It sounded right to him at the time. He sold the shop for $195,000. The money went into a joint account. 3 days after the check cleared, Lydia disappeared without a trace. George managed to trace her through credit card activity to Costa Rica, but by the time he got there, the money was gone, washed through multiple accounts, impossible to recover. She targets men with aging parents and family assets, George said. That's her thing. She studies them first, knows everything before she even says hello. He hesitated. Does your son have access to your house or your finances? Not yet, but she's setting it up. Then you still have time. Stop her before she gets him to sign anything. After I hung up, Tom and I sat quietly for a long moment. Harold suspected all of this, Tom finally said. He came to me 6 months before he died, asked for my help, said he had a friend, a private investigator named Peter Coleman. They were working together. Why didn't Harold tell me? He said he needed solid proof. He knew Scott was too in love to believe otherwise. Tom opened a drawer and handed me a business card. Peter's been waiting. You should call him. I looked at the card. Asterisk Peter Coleman, Private Investigations. Asterisk, a local number. First, I need to go to the bank. First National was across town. I drove there with Harold's file on the passenger seat and the small wooden box with the key in my purse. The bank was busy. It was Friday afternoon. People cashing checks, chatting, going about their lives. I asked for access to the safe deposit boxes. The manager, a woman in her 50s, led me to the vault, box 447. The key slid in perfectly. Inside was a single envelope. I opened it. Stock certificates in a plastic sleeve, supporting documents, a letter from Harold. Elaine, I bought this stock as a favor to a patient back in '94. His son was starting a tech company and needed early investors. I gave him $5,000, never expecting anything back. The patient passed away the next year, and I honestly forgot about these. Found them last month while organizing files. Looked up the company and nearly fell over. This is worth more than we ever saved. This is for you, for your future, for security. If you're reading this, something happened to me. Sell them when you're ready. Live well. Travel. Stay independent. Don't let anyone talk you out of it. You're taken care of. Harold. I brought the certificates to the manager. Can you tell me what these are worth? She checked her computer, her expression changing. Mrs. Bennet, TechCore Solutions went public last year. These shares are currently valued at around $342,000. I sat down, stunned. The manager brought me water. Are you okay? My husband bought these. She scrolled through records. Purchased May 1994 for $5,000. The company stayed private for 30 years, then went public. The stock's been climbing ever since. $342,000. Harold had left me financial security I never knew existed. I had resources now, power, options. I could fight Lydia on even ground. Saturday morning, I met Peter Coleman at a coffee shop near the hospital. Tom had called him to set it up. Peter was 55, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, with a calm, deliberate manner, former detective. He brought folders, spreading them out neatly on the table. Harold was my friend, he said. When I heard he'd passed, I wondered if Lydia would make her move. You kept watching her, I said. Harold made me promise not to contact you unless she turned her attention toward you. He didn't want to scare you with theories, but I never stopped tracking her. He opened a folder, revealing printouts. Here's her digital activity from the last 3 months. She's been active on caregiver forums under an alias, posting about how to convince older relatives they need professional help, asking about assisted living, memory care costs. Her browsing history shows real estate listings in Costa Rica. Financially, she's overextended. I traced 3 credit cards in Scott's name, totaling $32,000 in debt. Charges for designer clothing, fine dining, luxury hotels in Paris. Peter looked up. Scott makes $65,000 a year as an office manager. That doesn't cover this lifestyle. She's living on borrowed money he doesn't even know he owes yet. He laid out a sheet with a projected timeline, based on her past pattern. Phase 1. Paris trip, build the dream. Make Scott feel like he's not enough. Phase 2. The next couple of months, she'll start planting doubts about you. Suggest you're slipping. Phase 3. 4 to 6 months, she builds the case for assisted living. Phase 4. 6 to 8 months, she convinces Scott to sell your house. My house is paid off. Worth $320,000. Exactly, Peter said. Her total payout would be over $350,000. He closed the folder. She's in the setup stage right now. Once they're back from Paris, she'll start her campaign for real. Can the police stop her? Not yet. She hasn't broken any laws in this state. The previous scams were in Arizona and Florida. Until she takes money or commits fraud here, the police can't do anything. So we just wait for her to hurt us? We build the case now. Document everything. When she makes her move, we'll be ready. Peter leaned forward. And Scott needs to see the truth himself. If you confront him, she'll twist it, make him think you're paranoid. He has to discover it. I understood. Scott wouldn't believe me unless he found the proof on his own. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, writing a list of every little thing I'd noticed over the past 2 years. 2 months ago, Scott asking where I keep the house deed. 6 weeks ago, Lydia taking photos of every room when she came over. 1 month ago, Scott asking if I'd forgotten about lunch plans we never made. 3 weeks ago, Lydia saying I looked tired. 2 weeks ago, a brochure for Sunset Hills Senior Living falling out of Lydia's purse. The pattern was there, slow and deliberate. She'd been building her story, shaping Scott's perception so he'd believe his mother was slipping. I thought about the stock certificates and why Harold had kept them in the bank but hid his investigation in the car. The answer was clear. The bank was for valuables, for things safe from harm. The car was his private space. Lydia never went into the garage, never cared about his tools or projects. She stayed inside, and that's why the car was perfect for hiding something he didn't want her to find. He had thought of everything. I closed my notebook. Outside, the sun was setting, the spring air still and warm. Harold had protected me in every way possible. Left me security, left me proof, left me allies. Now it was my turn to protect Scott. They came back from Paris on Tuesday, both sun-kissed, looking rested but not quite happy. Scott's eyes showed lines of stress that hadn't been there before. I'd invited them for dinner, keeping everything normal. Made pot roast Harold's favorite, Scott's too when he was little. They arrived at 6. Lydia wore clothes I'd never seen before, a silk blouse, designer jeans, an expensive bag. I hugged Scott at the door. He held on a little longer than usual. Lydia's hug was quick, polite, just for show. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd taught Scott his homework, the same chairs Harold had refinished decades ago. From the moment we sat down, Lydia took charge of the conversation. Paris was incredible. The hotel in Les Marais was gorgeous. Lunch near the Louvre, dinner at a restaurant I couldn't pronounce. She described it all like a dream they'd earned, a lifestyle they deserved. It was wonderful, she said, but it made me realize how much we're missing out on. Scott works so hard, and we have so little to show for it. She looked right at me as she said it, and I knew what she meant. I kept my face calm. Pass the potatoes. Scott jumped in. Mom, you should think about traveling too, seeing things. Maybe someday. Lydia leaned forward. Elaine, this house is really too big for one person. Have you ever thought about downsizing? Maybe something easier to manage? There it was the first real move. I'm managing fine. This is my home. Of course, Lydia said with a polite smile. We just care about your safety. The stairs, the yard work. It's a lot at your age. Scott nodded. We worry about you here alone, Mom. He said we, not I. Her words in his mouth. I appreciate the concern, I said evenly. But I'm fine. Lydia let it go, but I saw it in her eyes, the calculation. The seed was planted. She'd push harder next time. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Coffee and the apple pie I'd baked. Lydia excused herself. Bathroom? Down the hall? She was gone 10 minutes. I waited 5, then excused myself too. Found her upstairs near Harold's old office. The bathroom door behind her was open and empty. She jumped when she saw me. Oh, I got turned around. This house has so many rooms. The bathroom's downstairs, where it's always been. She laughed lightly and touched my arm. Of course, silly me. Too much wine with dinner. I walked her back downstairs and said nothing more. They left about an hour later, Lydia smiling like nothing happened. Take care of yourself, Elaine. We'll visit again soon. Scott hugged me. Love you, Mom. I watched them drive off, then went straight to my notebook and wrote down every detail while it was still fresh. Wednesday morning, I called Scott. I need to talk to you about something. Can you come by? Just you. What's it about? Your father. Something I found in his things. Silence. Lydia and I don't keep secrets, Mom. This is between you and me. Please, Scott. A pause. Okay, this afternoon. I'll have to tell Lydia where I'm going. That's fine. He showed up at 3, alone like he said, but I could tell he was on edge. I'd made coffee and laid Harold's investigation file on the kitchen table. Scott saw it and stiffened. Mom, if this is about the car again, sit down, please. He did, arms crossed, already defensive. I took a breath, steady and clear, the way I'd spoken to families in the ICU. Before I show you anything, I need you to listen. Really listen. Can you do that? This feels like an ambush. It's protection. I handed him Harold's letter first. Read it. He did. The color drained from his face. Dad was investigating Lydia for 18 months before he died. His reaction came fast, anger, denial. Dad never liked her. He was paranoid about everything. This is crazy. I stayed calm. Look at the evidence. I spread the photos across the table. Lydia at 2 different weddings with 2 different men. The marriage certificates beside them. Lydia Cortland married Stanley Wright. Lydia Cortland married George Murphy. Scott stared. This could be anyone, just someone with the same name. Call them. Ask about their wives. I handed him the paper with their numbers written in Harold's careful handwriting. Stanley Wright, Phoenix. George Murphy, Tampa. You want me to call random strangers? They're not random. They were married to your wife before you. Scott stood and started pacing. This is insane. Lydia wouldn't. She loves me. Then prove me wrong. Call them. Prove your father wrong. He grabbed the paper, crumpled it in his fist. I'm not doing this. He headed for the door. Scott, please. He turned. Why are you doing this? Can't you just let me be happy? My voice cracked. Because your father died trying to protect you, and I'm not going to let his last months be for nothing. Scott slammed the door and drove off. I didn't know if he'd call those men or go straight to Lydia. Either way, it was up to him now. The waiting was unbearable. I sat at the kitchen table, unable to eat or think. Peter called at 8 to check in. How did it go? He was angry. I don't know what he'll do. Give him time. The truth takes a while to settle. But it felt like time was slipping away. At midnight, the phone rang. Scott's name on the screen. Scott? His voice was wrecked, raw. "I called them, Mom. I called both of them." He was crying. "What did they say?" "Everything. Stanley's mother. George's father's shop. It's the same. Exactly the same story." My heart broke for him. "I'm so sorry. I went home after I left your house." He was furious, his voice trembling, but he said he kept thinking about Dad and those marriage certificates. So I decided to test her. Just simple questions. "What happened?" I asked where she grew up, what her maiden name was, told her to tell me about her family. His breath came uneven. Her answers were different. Not slightly, completely different from what she'd told me before. Different hometown, different college, everything. "What did you do?" I pushed. Asked about the credit cards. Peter found the ones in my name I didn't know existed. Scott's tone went flat. Her whole face changed, Mom, like she took off a mask. She said they were business investments. That I wouldn't understand. So I asked what business. Told her to show me. She said she didn't have to prove anything to me, that I should trust my wife. I kept pressing, told her I wanted to see the statements there in my name. She packed a bag right there. No more pretending. Said I was weak. Said I was exactly what Dad thought, just like all of them. His voice cracked. She walked out, just got in her car and left. I've been calling her phone. She won't answer. "Stay there. I'm calling Peter Coleman." I hung up and dialed Peter right away. He picked up on the first ring. "I'm already tracking her through the credit cards. She checked into the airport Marriott an hour ago. She's leaving. Made several cash withdrawals in the last 2 hours, around 12 grand total. And she just booked a flight." He paused. "Mexico City, 6 a.m. Departure. One way." My stomach dropped. "She's running." "Yes, but there's more. Lydia Cortland is a stolen identity." The real Lydia Cortland died in a car crash in 2018. This woman's real name is Linda Marsh. She's wanted for fraud in 2 other states under different aliases. Can the police stop her? I've already contacted detectives in Arizona and Florida. They're issuing a warrant. If we move now, we can intercept her at the airport before she boards. What do you need? By the time Scott arrived, his eyes were red, dark circles underneath. He hadn't slept. He sat at the kitchen table while Peter laid everything out. Lydia's on a 6 a.m. flight. Police are ready to arrest her on existing warrants, but we need your statement about the forged credit cards. That means this goes public, Peter said. You'll have to testify. Are you ready for that? Scott looked at me. What would Dad do? Your father spent his last months building a case against her. He died before he could finish it. He'd want you to stop her not for revenge, but so she can't hurt anyone else. Scott sat quiet for a long time, then nodded. Call the police. Let's go to the airport. We got into Peter's car and drove through the empty streets. 4 a.m, the city still half asleep, streetlights flickering against the quiet. Scott sat in the back, staring straight ahead. I reached back and took his hand. He squeezed it tight. The airport was just waking up when we arrived. Coffee shops opening, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, business travelers rolling their suitcases. We stood behind a column near security. Peter positioned us where we could see without being seen. 2 detectives in plain clothes waited by the checkpoint. Scott hadn't spoken since the drive, just stared forward. I stayed close beside him. At 5:30, the security line grew longer. Then Lydia appeared. 2 large suitcases, a designer coat, sunglasses, even in the dim light, hair perfectly styled. She looked like someone heading off on vacation, calm, confident, phone in one hand, boarding pass in the other. She joined the line and pulled her luggage forward. The detectives moved in. Ma'am, we need to speak with you. Lydia turned, saw them. For a moment, her face changed. Then she smiled. Is there a problem, officers? The detective showed his badge. We have a warrant for your arrest. Linda Marsh. Lydia's smile froze. I don't know who that is. My name is Lydia Bennett. Ma'am, please step aside. Lydia looked around, calculating, saw the second detective blocking the exit. She bolted, dropped her bags, kicked off her heels, and ran barefoot across the polished floor. Airport security stopped her before she made it 20 feet, tackling her near the departure board. She fought, kicking and screaming. Get off me. I haven't done anything. Travelers stopped to watch, phones raised. Police cuffed her right there on the floor, reading her rights as she thrashed. A detective opened her abandoned luggage at the checkpoint. The first suitcase held clothes and toiletries, nothing unusual. The second was full of cash bundled stacks held by rubber bands. Later, the detective told us it totaled $48,000. Inside were also a passport with her picture but under a different name, Linda Brennan, along with documents, bank account details, and an external hard drive. The detective held up the passport. "Care to explain this?" Lydia spat at him. They lifted her off the floor, still struggling, until she spotted us, Scott and me, 30 feet away. She froze, then her expression twisted into pure fury. "You!" She lunged, but the officers held her back. "You did this." Scott flinched. "You pathetic, weak fool, just like the others. You really thought someone like me wanted you? You're nothing." "Nothing." I stepped slightly in front of Scott, my hand on his arm. Lydia turned on me, her voice venomous. "And you, meddling old woman, this was mine, my score. 3 years I spent on this. You should have stayed out of it and died already." Her words echoed through the terminal as people stared and filmed. I didn't react, just stood there while the police dragged her away, her voice still shrieking threats that faded as they led her through the security doors. Then she was gone. Scott stood frozen. "Let's go home," I said quietly. 2 weeks later, we sat in a police station giving formal statements. Detective Ramirez explained what they'd uncovered. Lydia's real name was Linda Marsh, born in Ohio, started running scams at 20. Small cons at first, then identity theft, elder fraud. The identity, Lydia Cortland, had been stolen from a real woman who died in a car crash 6 years earlier. So far, they'd found 5 previous victims, 2 before Stanley. The pattern stretched back 8 years. She faced charges in 3 states, Arizona, Florida, and here. Identity theft, fraud, theft by deception, forgery. The prosecutor expected a plea deal 12 to 15 years in federal prison. Stanley Wright and George Murphy's cases were reopened with new evidence, and both might recover part of their money through civil suits. Scott's fraudulent debt was mostly cleared. 1 month later, Scott appeared at my door with 2 suitcases. "Can I stay here? Just for a while?" "Of course." He took his old room, the same one from high school, posters still up, football trophies still lined on the shelf. The marriage was annulled. Legally, it had never existed. Lydia had married him under a false identity. Scott started therapy, twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Some days he seemed okay, made breakfast, helped around the house, even smiled a little. Other days he barely spoke, stayed in his room, only coming out to eat. I didn't press, just kept things steady. Cooked his favorite meals, left the lights on, kept coffee ready. Years as a nurse had taught me how healing works. It's never neat, it takes time. 2 months after the airport, the prosecutor called. Lydia had accepted the plea deal, 12 years, federal prison. I told Scott over dinner. He just nodded, silent. That Saturday, I found him in the garage, sitting on Harold's old work stool, holding the work journal, tears streaming down his face. I stood in the doorway and waited. "I found this on the bench," he said thickly. Started reading. He opened to a page from years ago, Harold's handwriting filling it. "Taught Scott to change the oil today. He's 12, old enough to learn. His hands are still small but careful. He listened to every word. So proud of him." Scott's hands trembled as he turned the page. Another entry. "Scott came by to help with the engine rebuild. We worked all afternoon. Barely talked. Didn't need to. These are the days I'll remember." "I barely remember this," Scott said quietly. "Working on the car with him. I was just a kid. I sat beside him on the workbench. He loved those days," I said. "He talked about them all the time." "I sold his car," Scott's voice cracked. "The car he spent 20 years building. $15,000 for a trip to impress a woman who was planning to destroy our family. You didn't know." "I should have." Dad tried to warn me. Those last few months, he kept asking about Lydia, about our plans, about money. I thought he was just being controlling. He wiped at his eyes. The last time we talked, we fought about her. I told him to back off, to let me live my life. He died a week later. I never said I was sorry. My throat tightened. "He knew you loved him." Scott shook his head. "How could he? I chose her over him. Over you. Over everything he taught me. I pulled out Harold's letter, the one he'd hidden in the car, the one about waiting for proof before telling Scott. I'd kept it close, waiting for the right time. Read this. Scott took the letter and read Harold's words about not wanting to break his heart without solid evidence, about loving him, about understanding that Scott was a victim too. He understood, I said. He knew how good she was at manipulation. He never blamed you. Scott broke down completely, sobs shaking through him. I wrapped my arms around him, holding my son the way I had through every heartbreak. But this pain cut the deepest. We stayed there in the garage for a long time, surrounded by Harold's things, his tools, his workbench, his old radio, the scent of oil and leather. Eventually, Scott's crying quieted. He wiped his face with his sleeve. "I wish the car was still here," he said hoarsely. "I'd learn everything about it, just like Dad wanted." I didn't say anything, only squeezed his shoulder. He closed the journal and set it back on the workbench exactly where Harold had left it. We walked back inside as the evening settled in, spring turning into summer, the air warm and heavy. I made dinner while Scott set the table without being asked. The house felt different, no longer empty, not completely whole yet, but healing, piece by piece. The week after Lydia was sentenced, I paid off the rest of Scott's debt, $5,000 the fraud claims hadn't covered. I wrote the check and never mentioned it again. The stock certificates Harold left me gave me more freedom than I'd ever imagined, $342,000, more than we'd saved our entire marriage. I thought about what to do with it. Stanley Wright, his mother had died, heartbroken in a memory care home she didn't need. George Murphy, his father's shop, gone after 40 years of work. I sent each of them a check for $10,000 with a note, "For your mother's memory, from someone who understands. Elaine Bennett." For myself, I decided to stay in the house. Maybe travel a little short trips, nothing extravagant. Stay independent, just like Harold wanted. 2 months after the airport, one Saturday morning, I heard the rumble of an engine outside, deep, strong, familiar. I looked out the kitchen window. The Shelby sat in my driveway, its burgundy paint glinting in the sunlight. Tom Graves was behind the wheel. My chest tightened. Upstairs, Scott's door opened, his footsteps coming down fast. He'd heard it too. We both stepped outside onto the porch. Tom climbed out of the car and smiled when he saw our faces. "Bringing her home where she belongs," he said. Scott stared at the car, unable to move or speak. Tom walked toward us and held out the keys to me. "This was never mine, Mrs. Bennett. Harold built it for you." I struggled to find words. "Tom, you paid Scott $15,000. "I know," Tom said, shaking his head. "But this car's worth more than money. Harold would want you to have it. He'd want Scott to learn it. That's what matters." Scott's voice came out rough. "I sold it. I threw it away." Tom looked at Scott. "You were a victim too. Your dad knew that. That's why he built the case to protect you." He handed me the keys. "Harold once told me this car was never really his. He built it for his family, for the people he loved." He motioned toward the garage. "Want a hand backing her in?" We opened the garage door together. Tom eased the Shelby into its old spot, the same place it had been months ago, the oil stain still marking the concrete. When the engine shut off, silence filled the space, and the air slowly returned to the scent it always had: motor oil, leather, Harold. Tom stepped out, studying the car. "He'd be proud of you," he told me, "for stopping her, for protecting your son." He looked at Scott. "And proud of you for coming back, for healing." After coffee, Tom hugged us both and left. Scott and I stood in the garage after he drove away, the Shelby gleaming between us. "I can't believe it's back," Scott said. "Neither can I." He ran his hand over the hood, tracing the smooth paint. "I don't deserve this." "Harold thought you did," I said. "That's enough." 3 months later, on a quiet Sunday morning, we started. Scott brought Harold's work journal to the garage. I brought coffee. We lifted the hood, staring at the engine Harold had rebuilt piece by piece. "I don't even know where to start," Scott admitted. I flipped open the journal to a page marked "Teaching Scott." Harold's handwriting was steady and neat. "Start with the oil," I read aloud. "Check it first, every time. Before you drive her, know she's ready." Scott found the dipstick, pulled it out, checked the level just like the notes said. His hands were steadier now, 3 months of therapy showing in his calm. We spent the morning working through the car, checking fluids, inspecting filters, testing systems. It was slow, physical work, the kind that clears the mind. step by step, following Harold's notes. As the hours passed, Scott's confidence grew. I saw Harold in his movements, the focus, the patience, the gentle way he handled every tool. By afternoon, Scott was smiling for real. "I forgot how much I loved this," he said. "Being out here, working with my hands. Your dad loved these days with you," I said. "I remember more now," he murmured. The way he'd explain everything twice, just to make sure I got it. The way he'd let me try, even when I messed up. He closed the hood carefully. "I'm going to take care of this car, the way he wanted. We'll take care of it," I said. "Together." 4 months after Tom brought the car back, I knew it was time. Saturday morning, spring sliding into summer, I stood in the garage holding the keys. Scott came out. "You ready?" "I think so." We got in. He took the passenger seat. I slid behind the wheel. The leather seat felt cool beneath me, the steering wheel worn smooth where Harold's hands had gripped it for 20 years. I adjusted the mirrors, double-checked everything like the journal said, and turned the key. The Shelby came alive, its deep growl vibrating through my chest, the sound of Harold's craft, his patience, his love. I eased it out of the garage. Scott's hand rested on the door handle, a little nervous but trusting. We rolled down Oakwood Drive, windows open, warm air spilling in, the engine humming steady and strong. Scott laughed. Dad would be losing his mind right now. In the best way. He taught me to drive when I was 17, on a stick. I stalled it 6 times. He never lost his cool. "This is easier." We drove with no plan, through town, past the hospital where I'd spent half my life, past the high school where Scott used to play football, just driving. The Shelby handled beautifully, every curve and gear shift carrying 20 years of Harold's devotion. After an hour, I turned back home, pulled into the driveway, and backed the car into the garage. Perfect fit, like it had never left. I shut off the engine and sat in the stillness that followed. "Dad would be so proud of you," Scott said. "Of us?" I corrected. That evening, I made dinner. Scott came down to help, chopping vegetables the same careful way Harold used to. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. The garage was alive again, Harold's tools hanging neatly on the pegboard, his journal resting on the workbench, the Shelby back where it belonged. I glanced out the window toward the garage and thought about Harold's letter. "I'm still protecting you." He was. The investigation he started, the stalks he'd left, Tom keeping his word. Harold had loved me enough to plan for everything. I wasn't alone. I never had been. It's been a year since that morning in the garage when the Shelby came home. Time moves differently now, slower, but somehow fuller. The kind of slow that lets you breathe again, lets you taste your coffee instead of gulping it while thinking about what's next. Life has settled into something quiet but steady, like a heartbeat you stop noticing until it's gone. Scott still lives here, for now. He's back at work, part-time at first, helping a friend restore vintage cars out on the west side of town. Some days, when I drive by the shop, I see him through the open bay door, his head bent under the hood, grease on his hands, and I think, Harold would have loved this. He's lighter these days. The grief still hits him in waves, but they don't drown him anymore. He's even started to laugh again, the kind of laugh that fills a room. We talk about Harold more now, not in whispers, but with warmth. We let the stories breathe. The house feels alive again. I keep the kitchen bright, the counters clean, the radio always tuned to the oldies station Harold loved. On Sundays, I make his pot roast, not because I'm trying to hold on to the past, but because it still feels like home when it's simmering in the oven. The garage has become our shared space. I garden in the mornings, Scott works on the Shelby in the afternoons, and sometimes, when the light fades just right, I swear I can still hear Harold humming from his workbench, that low, absent-minded tune he always fell into when something finally clicked into place. After the trial ended, I sold a few things, nothing that mattered, just the clutter that filled the corners of a life too big for one person. I took a trip, small but meaningful. Seattle first, then the Oregon coast. I stayed in little motels with ocean views and the smell of salt through cracked windows. For the first time, I drove the Shelby farther than a few miles around town. The engine purred smooth as silk, the highway wide open ahead of me. Every mile felt like shedding a layer of old pain. When I reached Cannon Beach, I parked by the dunes, stepped out, and let the wind whip through my hair. I could almost feel Harold beside me, smiling that quiet, proud smile of his. People sometimes tell me I was brave, how I faced down Lydia, how I pieced everything together. But I don't think it was bravery. It was love. The kind of love that holds steady when everything else falls apart. I think Harold knew that when he left me those letters. He knew I'd find the strength when I had to. And maybe that's the legacy we leave, the quiet strength we pass to the people we love. I've joined a support group at the community center. Mostly women, some older, some younger, all with their own stories. We drink coffee that tastes faintly like cardboard and talk about loss and starting over. It's not therapy exactly, but it helps. One woman, June, lost her husband to cancer 5 years ago and now teaches painting. She convinced me to take one of her classes. My first painting was a disaster, muddy colors and crooked lines, but I kept it anyway. It sits framed on the wall now, right above the fireplace. A reminder that beauty can exist even when you don't quite know what you're doing. Scott's been talking about moving out again, getting his own place. He says it's time. I can tell he's scared, but I also know he needs to try. Last week, he showed me a listing for a small apartment near the river, nothing fancy, but with a garage big enough for 2 cars. One for mine, he said, and one for when you visit. That made me smile. As for me, I've started volunteering at the hospital again. Not in the ICU, I don't have the stamina for 12-hour shifts anymore, but I visit the long-term patients, bring coffee to nurses, listen when someone just needs to talk. It feels good to be useful again, to feel needed. Sometimes at night, I sit in the garage with a cup of tea, the door half open to let in the breeze. The Shelby catches the moonlight just so, gleaming like a heartbeat frozen in metal. I think about Harold, about the way he built things that lasted, engines, memories, love. I think about how life has a way of breaking us open, just enough to let the light in. I still wear my wedding ring. Maybe I always will. It's not about holding on anymore. It's about honoring what was real. The love we built, the life we lived, the son we raised. Harold once wrote, *, I'm still protecting you. *, I used to think that meant from danger. Now I think it means something else. Protection not from pain, but from forgetting, from losing the courage to keep living. Summer's coming again. The hydrangeas are starting to bloom by the fence. Scott's already talking about taking the Shelby to a car show next month. I told him he should drive. He grinned like a kid and said, "You'll ride shotgun, right?" I told him, always. When I go to bed at night, the house is quiet but peaceful, the kind of quiet that feels earned. Sometimes I dream of Harold, his hands steady on the wheel, the road stretching out ahead of us. He turns to me and says, "You're doing just fine, Elaine." And when I wake up, for the first time in a long time, I believe him. Life has taught me one thing. Real love isn't found in promises, but in quiet sacrifice and unwavering faith. Harold may be gone, but he still protects my son and me with the love and careful foresight he left behind. If there's one message I want to leave you with, it's this: never lose faith in yourself, and never let pain make you forget the value of honesty and family. Trust your instincts, because sometimes your heart recognizes the truth long before your mind does. And what about you? If you were in my place, if your son had been deceived, if everything you built was falling apart, would you choose forgiveness, or would you fight to protect what your husband worked his whole life to build? I truly want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening to my story on Stories of Mom Donna. May God bless you and your family with peace and grace.